All right, next up we've got Tyler Bay. Hey, Tyler.
Hey, Chris. How you doing?
Excellent. How you doing?
Pretty good.
So give us a little background on yourself. Who is Tyler Bay?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a 3D artist, originally from Denver, Colorado, and I currently live out in Nashville. And my backstory is kind of interesting because I decided to go out to Nashville and start my own gig, doing freelancing and starting a tutorial website called cgforge.com. And so ever since I've been out here, that's been what I've been doing. And CG Forge is just an awesome place to find tutorials that are really high quality. I take my time making them. I go through all kinds of different levels of quality as I make these tutorials, and that's pretty much what I do now.
Cool. So tell us about the presentation you're going to be doing today.
Sure. So this one's about Sparse Pyro, and lately I've been playing around with Sparse Pyro. It's a new type of way of simulating pyro in Houdini 18. And I'll be giving an example where we have some fireballs that are wrapping around a tower. And I'll just talk about what that general workflow looks like, why it will save you lots of time for certain simulations, and what you can do with it.
Right on. Let's jump in.
Sounds great.
So here we have the tower scene, and this is the scene that I've been using lately for shading and texturing. But for this presentation, we'll talk about Sparse Pyro and these really cool, stylized, almost claymation-like fireballs that are whizzing around the tower. Now, if you use the old legacy Pyro solver, this particular simulation would be a real pain to make. And the reason why is because you really only have two options. Option one is you could take the bounding box and surround this entire scene, and with every single step, think about every single voxel which exists in this scene, which exists within the region that the fireballs are traveling. That's not really a great method. It's going to take forever if you do that. Or you can also use clusters, and so you basically create your boxes adaptively as the fireball moves through space. But the issue with that is that it can get fairly complicated, and there's just a lot more moving parts with that particular technique. So this is where Sparse Pyro comes into play. It's great for a simulation where there's a lot of areas that don't need the solver's attention. And that's the main thing that it does. If you have areas in your scene that don't really matter, or areas that aren't seeing any kind of simulation taking place, you don't want the solver thinking about those areas. And that's exactly what the Sparse Pyro allows you to do. It allows you to ignore those zones. In effect, what this does is it speeds up your simulation times by quite a bit, even if you compare to the performance of OpenCL, which is something I'll talk about here in a minute. Even considering that, it speeds it up, and it also simplifies a lot of the workflow that used to be fairly complicated with the legacy Pyro. Let's dive into the scene, and I'll show you how this generally works. To the right-hand side, we have the geo, the lights, the camera, all of that kind of stuff in one space. Now, we don't have to worry about that because it doesn't matter for this tutorial. The real magic happens right here in this PyroSim section. And what we have at the top is 3 control spheres that correlate with the 3 fireballs and 3 curves which are used to dictate the animation on those fireballs. So if we dive here into the control sphere 1 network, I have a point and I have a sphere that's being deformed with this mountain sop. So nothing too fancy here. And the reason why I have this point separated is because this is what the Pyro source is going to ultimately pick up when I create a source for the Pyro. So here we have source Pyro. I bring in that point right here with the object merge, and then I use a copy to point with a different deforming sphere being instanced to that. Or I should say being copied to that. It's not really an instance. Now at first glance, that might be kind of weird. You might be wondering, well, why didn't I just bring in that regular sphere, that original deforming sphere, instead of having a point and copying to points? Well, the reason why is because by having a different deforming sphere being used for the pyro source, it's going to engulf the front end of the fireball just a little bit more. Because if we just used this sphere right here, the front portion right here would not see really as much happening because the fire is shooting the opposite direction and it just leaves the front here a bit more exposed. So that's why I have a different sphere being used for the source. Now, that gets copied to points. I have a switch that switches between the three spheres. So we have blue, green, and yellow. And the next thing I'm thinking about at this point is scale. Now, this is something that I talk about a lot in my pyro courses. Scale, in my opinion, is something that you want to think about first, because if you keep the scale of your pyro simulations consistent, then that's going to keep the settings that you use also consistent. In other words, it doesn't matter if you have a building, it doesn't matter if you have a candle. If you bring that pyrosim to exist within a meter by meter scale, not only do all the defaults work better by default, but it also keeps your workflow consistent from project to project. So that's what's happening here. And that's also another reason why I have a separate sphere, is so that I have better control over how exactly I want to scale this for the pyro. Now on the sphere, I start here with a meter diameter. So this box here is a meter, the sphere is also a meter. You have to set the uniform scale here to 0.5, by the way, to do that. But that's where I start. I then scale down this sphere like that, so I can figure out how big that sphere is going to be when it gets copied over here. So we copy to points, and again, we just have the same sphere happening right there, right? So once this has been copied and we're matching exactly what we had up here with the control sphere 1, except with the slightly different sphere, now we scale up back to that meter scale. So now this right here is a meter by a meter again, and this is going to react consistently with the pyro settings when it's scaled up to a meter. So I take the invert transform, by the way, to do that. So I just take this scale down and I inverted that. So now we're scaled up, and as we go, it's still following that curve. So this is what we'll use to simulate the pyro on. And then once we're done simulating, we'll then bring it back down to the smaller scale. Once we have that sphere, the next thing to do is to scatter points. These points will eventually control the initial field values, the values that get sourced into DOPS. And we assign these attributes here with the pyro source. So I scattered about 1,000 points. That seems to do just fine. And the pyro source here is including density, temperature, and flame. Now, for those of you used to the old pyro solver, flame is the big difference that you're not used to seeing. And this is how the Sparse Pyro workflow has simplified its combustion model. Before, you used to have two fields, temperature and fuel, in order to get burn, which eventually created heat. And heat was ultimately what you rendered for fire. But the problem is that workflow was a bit complicated. You have 4 fields that you had to manage, and it was just a bit difficult to control because everything was a little bit more arbitrary than it is here with the flame. This flame field is awesome because it basically is just going to start at a value of 1. It represents burn, it represents combustion. So wherever you have flame, that is where you used to have burn happening. And it's based off of, like, a value of 1 is based off of how long that flame is going to last. So a value of 1 for the flame is good to start. After this, we add some noises. I like cutting into the values, so I like using this multiplicative method right here. If you keep the values normalized, in other words, in between 0 and 1, it's a little bit easier to control once you hit DOPS. So we have multiplicative right here as a 1D noise, and that's being set to flame. Now the noise type here is whirly, and I have a distribution with a high degree of contrast. So most of the values are either going to be 0, which is on the left-hand side, or a value of 1 on the right-hand side. So all this happens right there. I have a large scale noise, so think bigger shapes, and then I also have a smaller scale noise with a smaller element size. And so we have 0.25, 0.15, and I do the same thing for temperature and density, except for temperature and density, I keep that at a large noise. Now, once we have all that, I use a trail to compute velocity so that we're now thinking about where these points are going. That, in turn, has a velocity attribute. And if we go here to the geo spreadsheet, this is what our points now have. We have density, flame, temperature, velocity. These are the volumes we want to generate. These are the things that we want to feed the Pyro solver so that it can give us what we want. Now, once we do that, I inverted the velocity. So I just, within this point wrangle, said times equal -1. And what that will do is instead of velocity going in this direction, which is the direction the sphere is going, I inverted that so that now it's going that way. We want to use velocity to control where the fire is going to go, right? So we want the fire going this way, and so that's why I inverted that. Down here we have the volume rasterized node, which takes all those attributes and creates volumes which represents those values. So now we don't have points anymore, we have voxels. Those voxels contain values that associate with the attribute values. So that gives us density, flame, temperature, and velocity. Now with this, I decided to also use the velocity blur, so that stretched out our smoke source a little bit. And the most important thing here is that we middle mouse and we keep an eye on this voxel count. My recommendation is to always try to aim for about 300,000 to 500,000 voxels as you're sourcing this out. You don't want your source to be too much because that'll make a big difference on your sim times, but if you go too low, then you miss out on detail. So for most situations, again, I'd recommend somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000. Now this gets cached out. I do 3 caches for the blue, green, and yellow. That gets determined up here, again by this switch. And once that gets cached out, all that info goes over here to the DOPNet. Now within the DOPNet, we again have a switch that decides between blue, green, or yellow. And the fields I'm bringing in are the same exact fields that we rasterized. So for this particular situation, I decided not to use density. That's going to be 0. And if we go down, we have flame and we have velocity. And I also have temperature, which I decided not to use at a scale of 0. Now, the reason why I'm not using density and I'm not using temperature is because for density, I decided to have this stylized look, and I didn't want the smoke behaving differently than the fire. You could do that for a bit of detail, but I just wanted the flames to feel more solid as it went through the air, more like a physical object. And so the density would have broken that illusion a little bit. And so that's why that's at 0. And the temperature is also at 0 because I don't want the flames moving up in the Y direction. I just want it listening to velocity, which is right here. Okay, so that's what's happening right there. This goes to the Pyro solver right here. Do keep in mind that for Sparse Pyro, we have a Pyro solver sparse solver instead of just a regular Pyro solver. So just watch out for that. It's a separate thing. So we have that. And likewise with the smoke object. This is also a sparse smoke object. Now, for those of you watching who have already worked with the old Pyro solver, you might be thinking, oh, wait a second, you don't have any temperature, so how can you have combustion with no temperature? Well, like I said, combustion works differently with sparse solvers. We don't need temperature anymore to create burn. We don't need temperature to create combustion or fire. All we need is flame. And that's all you need to allow fire to happen. So that's a big difference between the old way of working and this way of working. And it's something that might be a bit confusing at first when you go to use the Sparse Pyro solver. So just be mindful of that. You don't need temperature. As a matter of fact, temperature, if you add that in, isn't going to give you any more flame. It's just going to essentially bring up the velocity going upwards in the y direction. So it's not actually going to cause your flame to last longer or cause a bigger explosion. It's not how you control that. We have other ways of controlling how big, let's say, an explosion is or how big a fire is, but temperature is only going to really matter when you're trying to stretch things in the y direction. Another workflow adjustment with temperature here is that it's also recommended that you set this to max and you leave the scale at no larger than 1, or just at 1, I would say. Because if you want to have more velocity as a result of the temperature, we have settings now in the solver itself under this temperature section, so simulation temperature, which can control how fast something is moving based on temperature. And that's going to refer to the ambient temp versus the reference temp. That's going to determine the buoyancy, which basically determines how quickly something is rising. So, long story short, with temperature, don't control that through the source. Instead, try looking up the ambient temperature in Kelvin, figure out what that temperature might actually be in the real world, then look at the explosion itself, figure out the temperature of the explosion, what that might approximately be, and that'll give you a much more realistic behavior when it comes to the velocity that gets generated by this temperature. So just keep that in mind. That's also a different workflow with the Sparse Pyro. And it's a much better workflow because this now simplifies temperature so that it's just about that buoyancy. It's not about controlling the combustion. It's not about affecting all these other fields as much as it used to. Now you can just isolate temperature for the buoyancy and that contribution and not worry as much about what it's doing to the other fields. So that's very nice. That adds a lot more control to your simulations. So as you can see, with every single step, the active region is being adjusted. And we actually have a field called active as well. The active field represents voxels which are, well, active. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's just voxels that are being utilized in a way where the values aren't 0. And so the great thing about that is, again, this is all adaptive. We only have to think about the areas that matter. And because of that, this simulates really, really quickly. Also notice that on the smoke object, we no longer have different options for how to adjust the resolution. We only have this voxel size. And that makes sense, right? Because before we used to have max axis, which looked at the maximum axis of the bounding box and cut it up into even slices. But that doesn't make sense because this box is moving all the time. And if we set it to a number, then the resolution changes on every single step, and that's not good. So instead, this voxel size, or it's the same as saying by size, just refers to how big each voxel is in meters. We can, however, specify a max size here, though. So we have this max size. We can see that by clicking on this domain, and let's zoom out a little bit. So we can have these maximum bounds that you set. It's not necessary, but it might be nice if, let's say, you want to have something bounce off the ground. We could treat, let's say, y as closed below a certain amount. We do have this center and max size though, and that refers to boundaries just in general. It doesn't refer to the areas that the solver will think about. But if, let's say, you want something to bounce off the ground, you could, first of all, check on this domain that shows you where this is, and you can go to treat y as closed below, let's say, -1, which basically just means that if smoke or fire or anything hits the ground here, it's going to bounce off. If you leave this open, then it'll just kill the values as they go past the box. Now, earlier you might have been wondering how to control the intensity of, let's say, an explosion without adjusting temperature, or essentially how would that work if you wanted to turn up the flames or turn up the explosion, what have you. Well, one way of doing that is on the Pyro solver, you have this flames tab, and this allows you to take the flame field and use that to affect other fields. So if we want, let's say, the flame field to also emit density or emit smoke, we can check on emit smoke. Now the flame field will emit smoke, and how much it does so as a whole is adjusted right here with the emission mount. And then we can also change the flame range so that if we have a flame range of, let's say, 0.2 to 0.5, it's emitting smoke. We can also fine tune that with a ramp down here. And so you might want to adjust the behavior of the explosion based off of what the flame values are doing. And so you can do that with smoke, you can do that with temperature, and you can also do that with divergence, which is this expansion tab right here. While we're here, we also have the shape tab, and that's just about the same as what you saw in the legacy Pyro solver. These are basically adding in microsolvers to adjust the specific behaviors that you want from the sim. In general, I like using the standalone microsolvers like this, and you can do so by plugging that into the forces input, which is on the very right-hand side of the Pyro solver. But by default, be aware that the dissipation is set to a fairly high value. I usually turn that down. And also we have this clamp below, which is unique to the Sparse Pyro solver. So the clamp below, what this is doing is we have density. We don't want really, really low density values hanging out and causing that box to not cut down in areas that don't matter, right? We want to keep our bounding box for the simulation effective. And so by clamping below a certain density value, that will cause the box, the bounding box, to clamp once the density value reaches below this value of 0.0005. That way, if you have a density value of, like, let's say 0.000001 somewhere, it's not like the bounding box is going to hang on to that info. It's going to cut it off and stay optimized. So in general, if you're emitting smoke, keep this clamp below on, because that'll keep your simulation more efficient. Just so you know, at the moment of recording, Sparse Pyro does not use OpenCL. If you try to use this, it won't work. But honestly, the advantages of this sparse workflow, in my opinion, would outweigh the speed gains you might have with OpenCL. There are situations where you will be able to simulate faster with OpenCL. But again, I choose the Sparse Pyro just because of the better workflow. I found that it's easier to control everything with the way that Sparse Pyro is set up. And so that might be a consideration if you're thinking about switching to Sparse Pyro versus sticking with the old OpenCL workflow. Also, I believe if you want to use, let's say, OpenCL with this new workflow, you can turn off this enable sparse solving, and that might be the best of both worlds. You can have the same workflow, but you can turn off the sparse solving and use your GPU if you so choose. With this scene, I think would actually go slower with OpenCL because remember, you don't get that adaptivity as the fireballs move through space. And so I haven't done the actual test of this, but I'm pretty sure OpenCL would actually be slower than using the Sparse Pyro solver with my particular rig. It all just depends on the situation that you're in. So remember how I said that the scale matters? Well, this is exactly why. Because when you go to your microsolvers, you want to have some sort of reference like this, which you can find for free, by the way, on Vimeo. And you want to be able to match the particular values with the look that you like. So I like the look of 0.05. That's what I did for this particular simulation. But again, it just goes to say that when you set your simulation to exist within a meter, these particular settings will remain consistent. So anyway, I repeated that process for shredding and turbulence, and this all ended up giving me the final simulation, which I gathered here in the Pyro imports. So I brought in the fields that I wanted, I cached them out, I cleaned up all the attributes except for name, so that left me with just the volumes. And then once I did that, I assigned a material, I scaled it back down to the original scale, and I was left with the final cache that can be used for rendering. Now, just in case you're wondering, I did do some fancy work with the shader, and even though I used Redshift, you could get the same exact thing using Mantra. It just takes a few different buttons, but if you know what you're doing, you can get the same exact look. The main thing here, the most important thing when making this stylized shader is to rely on the ramps for breaking up your voxel values. So that's what you see here with, let's say, the scatter ramp. That essentially correlates with how much light is illuminating the volume. And as a matter of fact, even though I simulated this as a fire sim, within the shader, I took the flame field, which is usually used for fire, and I put that in the smoke categories. What's really cool about that is it allowed shadows to be cast onto objects, and it also gave the smoke more of a tangible feel. Again, more of that feeling like you're looking at a solid object versus a flame. So the behavior acted like a flame, but the actual look of it ended up being more tangible. So anyway, I cranked that up. I have a lot of absorption right here that allowed for those darker areas. So light was able to really brighten up the smoke, or I guess the flame field, right? And then I paired that with a very heavy darkening here that also had a strange ramp just to break up those values. And I also, well, I was thinking about adding an emission channel, but I didn't. It was enough to just have the scatter right here showing off the bright parts. So I played around with the flame, but ended up not using it. So anyway, there you have it, guys. That's an overview of what I did here to make these sweet looking fireballs. The Sparse Pyro solver, again, it's a fairly straightforward method. It's a fairly straightforward workflow, and that's the beauty of it, right? It's not as much work. I find that it's easier to control, and it offers a lot of benefits when it comes to speed and simulation time as well. So that wraps up this presentation. I hope you guys enjoyed watching. Also, if you'd like to learn more about Pyro, I have a whole course dedicated to that, Pyro 2, and in the future, I'll also be working on Pyro 3, which will be large explosions and all kinds of cool stuff. So check out my website, CG Forge, if you like these tutorials and you want to support more of them. Until next time, thanks for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.